Everyone. We are going to be doing a quick presentation today on forces of evolution. We have already pretty significantly covered how natural selection works, so we're not really going to be talking about that too much more. You should already have quite a lot of that in your notes. Natural selection, just to recap, as it says here, the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. This little diagram shows in a nutshell how it works, as it says. So we have this original population with a mix of green and orange individuals. That would be the natural levels of variation that Darwin talked a lot about. Over time, we have this population of predators, in this case, the black birds, that are preferentially eating the green beetles. So over time, a couple of generations later, we have a population that is becoming increasingly orange because the green ones are being taken out of circulation. Over time, the green ones will be completely removed from the population because of the predators preferring them, and we'll end up with a population that is entirely orange. So we also talked about sexual selection. You should have this in your notes already. So we will talk a little bit about this here, but again, we won't focus too much on it. This quote from Darwin, you can read on your own time. Basically, he is talking about the concepts we've already talked about, where sometimes you have selection happening over time, you have populations changing over time as a result of mate choice and sexual preference, rather than just natural selection and the environment changing. So we have populations that can change due to two different types of sexual selection. The first is intrasexual selection, which Darwin described as being competition between males for access to females. This is most often how it happens. You can see the picture here of these two deer that are fighting with each other. What usually results from this type of selection is some kind of anatomical feature that's used for fighting, whether it's size or strength or horns or antlers, large canines, what have you. It's usually something some kind of feature that results as a means of fighting for access to females. The other type is intersexual selection. We've already kind of talked about this as well. Darwin referred to it as female choosiness or female choice. Most often, it's the female that's choosing the males based on some kind of physical attribute that they have. The classic example that we talked about in class and that's pictured here is male peacocks having these brightly colored feathers. They use these brightly colored feathers to attract mates, to attract the females, and the females are choosing to mate with certain males based on how they look. So the result of intersexual selection is typically going to be traits that don't really have much of a function. So the bright colored feathers that you see here don't really serve much of a function except to attract the females. Sexual selection results in something called secondary sex characteristics, which are traits that distinguish the two sexes of a species without being directly involved in reproduction. So these are the traits like the brightly colored head on this mallard duck, the mane over here on the lion, the nose that we see here in the male proboscis monkeys. These are the secondary sex characteristics. Sexual selection also leads to patterns of variation within species that are referred to as sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism is related to the concept of a secondary sex characteristic, but basically what we're talking about when we talk about sexual dimorphism is the degree of difference between the male and the female. So the secondary sex characteristics are the characteristics themselves. A male lion has a mane and a female lion does not. The concept of sexual dimorphism is basically a reference to how different the male and the female are. So we can see here in the center picture, this is a male orangutan and a female orangutan. We would say that males and females are quite different because the males are about twice the size of the females. And we would say that this species, orangutans, have high levels of sexual dimorphism. So when we talk about sexual dimorphism, we tend to talk about the concept as like in degrees. So a species either has high levels of sexual dimorphism or it has low levels of sexual dimorphism. In the case of orangutans, we're looking at high levels of sexual dimorphism because the males and the females are very significantly different from each other. Now, selection has three modes, so we're going to go over the three modes of selection here. This can apply for, we're kind of generally going to be using examples with regards to natural selection, but this is just generally how selection acts, whether it's sexual or natural selection. So the first one here, stabilizing selection, is when you have, as it says here, selection against the extremes and the individuals in the mean do well. So what this basically means is that you can have a population of animals and you can have a trait that stays the same over time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no selection acting. So in this example, we're talking about birth weight in humans. Birth weight stays the same over time. It doesn't go up and it doesn't go down. It stays pretty close to the mean. The mean is, I think, somewhere around 8 pounds in humans. Now, when we have stabilizing selection here, what we're talking about is a situation where individuals with extreme forms of the trait tend to do very poorly. So for birth weight, babies that are born at low birth weight tend to have poor outcomes. They have poor health later in life. They tend to have higher rates of SIDS and things like that. Overall, babies that have low birth weight tend to do poorly. Babies that have high birth weight also tend to do poorly, especially in pre-modern societies where we don't have modern medical intervention. The larger a baby is, the more difficult it is to actually pass through the mother's birth canal. So babies that have higher birth weights historically and prehistorically have tended to have selection acting against them as well. Babies that are born excessively large via natural birth will have more complications, like the baby physically can't fit through the mother's birth canal, resulting possibly in the death of the baby and the death of the mother. So in this case, selection is acting to keep birth weight around the same over time, somewhere around 8 pounds. So babies that are closer to the mean birth weight tend to do better than low birth weight babies or high birth weight babies. Directional selection is when one extreme does well, but the other does not. The population will move in one direction. The example that we already talked about in class is the peppered moth example. We won't go back over that. You can go back through your notes and look at it. But basically, to recap really quickly, we have a population of moths that change over time from being primarily light in color to being primarily dark in color, and then we have a reversal when the environment changes. So directional selection tends to push a population in one direction, and as with the case of the peppered moths, it can change directions as well. So when the environment changed, we had a shift back to the original color. The light colored moths kind of started to do better again. Disruptive selection is far more rare than either of the other three modes. In this circumstance, both extremes tend to do well, but those at the mean do not. So it's kind of like the opposite of stabilizing selection. In this case, you can have a population that begins to split in half. So you start to have what's called a divergence. The example that I have here is Darwin's finches. We talked about the adaptive radiation on the Galapagos Islands for Darwin's finches. And basically, we have a situation where we have an ancestral population of finches that probably had a medium-sized beak, for example. Over time, selection is acting against those individuals that have a medium-sized beak and is favoring those individuals that have larger beaks or smaller beaks. So we end up having selection against the mean here, and we're eventually going to end up with a split in the population. So as it says here, selection against the mean can lead to speciation, which just means that eventually you can have a population begin to split into two descendant populations. Okay, so we talked about selection. Natural selection and sexual selection are two of the four forces of evolution that we're talking about for this slide set. The third is mutation. Mutation is, at the end of the day, just changes or mistakes in the copying of the DNA. So as we go through DNA replication, it's basically the kind of natural process to accumulate errors over time in the copying of the DNA. I like to describe it as being the equivalent of like typos. If you're typing a paper and you're not being too careful with how you're typing, you're going to end up with typos. So basically the same thing is generally what's happening here with the copying of the DNA. Mutations are, as it says here, changes or mistakes in the copying of DNA, and they are the source of all variation in nature. So the ultimate source of all variation are these random mutations that appear during the copying of DNA. So over time, you will have these accumulations of these mutations, and you can eventually lead to kind of large-scale phenotypic changes as a result. The example that I have on the slide here is of a cow. Obviously, it's a breed of cow called the Belgian Blue breed. This is a cow that, as you can see, has kind of a weird physical characteristic. It has an excessive amount of muscle. This is caused by a single point mutation. Basically what happens is this single point mutation has caused changes in how muscle development is controlled in the species. So because of this single point mutation, this cow has excessive muscular growth. So you can have some pretty widespread physical changes that occur as a result of single point mutations. And again, the important thing to remember about mutations is that they are the ultimate source of all variation in nature. So that makes it really important. That makes mutations really important because variation is then what natural selection acts on later in time. The fourth force of evolution here, genetic drift. Genetic drift, as it says here, is the random loss or fixation of alleles from one generation to the next. In the case of genetic drift, we have frequencies changing over time due to chance. So genetic frequencies are changing, the genetic makeup of the population is changing over time, but it's not due to selection. So there's no selection acting, none of the individuals are being selected for by natural selection. You just have these random frequency changes over time that are due to chance. As it says here, genetic drift has a bigger effect in smaller and more isolated populations. As you can see here, an example of this would be something called the bottleneck effect. So we have this parent population where we have, it looks like about a 50-50 mix of yellow and blue marbles. If we dump some of these marbles out and create kind of a subpopulation, we have a drastic reduction in that population. So we only have a few surviving individuals here. Now, the genetic makeup of this offshoot population here in these little cups is not necessarily going to be a perfect reflection of the original parent population. So instead of having roughly 50-50 in terms of yellow and blue marbles, we now have a higher proportion of blue marbles and a lower proportion of yellow marbles. So once that population continues to grow, the next generation is going to be genetically different. In this case, we're going to have a different proportion of yellow and blue marbles in the next generation. So the changes in gene frequencies here that are being demonstrated by the changes in frequencies of blue and yellow marbles are changing due to chance and not due to selection. The last thing that we'll talk about here, founder effect, a special case of genetic drift. So founder effect is when you do have a smaller portion of the population that becomes separated, that doesn't have the original genetic diversity of the parent population. Genetic drift can lead to higher frequencies of deleterious alleles in a population. So that's what is kind of being demonstrated here. This is an Amish woman and her baby. The Amish, because they are genetically isolated from the mainstream American population, over time have accumulated higher frequencies of unusual alleles or rare alleles in their population. So this individual, this woman's baby, she is showing a baby that has a condition that is pretty common in the Amish. It's a condition called the Ellis von Creveld syndrome. Things that go along with the Ellis von Creveld syndrome include short legs. You can see the body proportions are a little off here, and polydactyly. So this baby has more than 5 fingers and toes on each foot. This is a condition that is pretty prevalent in the Amish community, all things considered. It's not very common at all. It's very infrequent and rare in the mainstream American population. The individuals in the Amish population that have this condition can all be traced back to a single couple that helped found the original Amish community in Pennsylvania in 1744. So a single couple that lived in that original community had this genetic variant, and as a result, a high number of the descendants within the modern Amish population have the same. The last one here, gene flow. Gene flow is pretty simple. As it says here, it's defined as the transfer of alleles from one group to another through matings across population boundaries. So what this just means is that you have these two populations that are mostly separate from one another, but there's still some mating that's happening across the population boundary. So you end up with genetic exchange at really low levels between these two populations. As it says here at the bottom, gene flow has a homogenizing effect, which means basically that even very low levels of gene flow between these two populations will keep the populations relatively similar. So homogenizing just means keeping the populations the same. So even low levels of gene flow, low levels of breeding between these two populations will keep the populations fairly similar genetically. It'll keep them from diverging too far away from each other genetically.